Something happened in the darkness between worlds that summer night. Picture yourself drifting back to July 20th, 1969, when the impossible was about to become routine, and secrets were being written in the silence of space. The whole world believed they knew what was happening 240,000 miles away, but some of the most remarkable moments would remain hidden for decades, waiting in the shadows of official history like whispered prayers in an empty cathedral. Feel the weight of history around you as we slip into Mission Control in Houston, where young men in white shirts and narrow ties sat before glowing consoles, their faces pale in the electronic amber light. The air conditioning hummed steadily against the oppressive Texas heat, but tension had a way of making everything feel warm and close, like standing too near a fire that threatened to consume everything you'd worked for. In one corner of that vast room, beneath banks of blinking lights and chattering teletype machines, a 24-year-old computer engineer named Jack Garman was quietly preparing for what he hoped would never happen. The fluorescent lights cast harsh shadows across his desk, where a single sheet of handwritten paper lay taped beneath a protective sheet of glass. Just weeks earlier, he'd watched his supervisor make a critical mistake during a routine simulation, calling an unnecessary abort when a cryptic computer alarm had appeared on the screens like an unwelcome ghost. Slowly, the scene shifts to that evening weeks before, when Gene Kranz, the flight director whose crew cuts and white vest had become legendary throughout NASA, pulled Garman aside with a request that seemed simple but carried enormous weight. "I want you to study every possible program alarm," Kranz had said, his voice carrying the quiet authority that had guided America through its greatest space adventures. "Whether they can happen or not, I want you to know them all." And so Jack had spent his evenings at home in his small Houston apartment, hunched over a kitchen table that doubled as his workspace, writing by hand on notebook paper, while his neighbors watched television and lived their ordinary lives. Each careful line contained a 4-digit computer code and a life-or-death decision written in blue ink. Go or no go. Some alarms meant instant abort, immediate retreat from humanity's greatest adventure. Others could be safely ignored, digital hiccups in the vast computational effort required to navigate between worlds. But a few fell into that dangerous gray area, where split-second judgment would determine whether humanity reached the moon or watched their greatest adventure end in failure and possibly tragedy. Time moves like honey as we travel through the layers of preparation and anticipation that had brought humanity to this moment. Every system had been tested thousands of times, every procedure rehearsed until it became second nature. Every possible failure mode analyzed and planned for. But space had a way of presenting challenges that no simulation could perfectly predict. Problems that required human intuition and courage rather than computational precision. Let yourself drift back to that winter night when everything seemed possible, but nothing was certain. The lunar module Eagle had separated from the command module Columbia just hours earlier. Its spider-like legs and angular geometry a stark contrast to the sleek curves of the spacecraft that had carried them from Earth. Inside that cramped metallic cocoon, Neil Armstrong sat on the left, Buzz Aldrin on the right. Both men compressed into a space smaller than a telephone booth, surrounded by instruments and switches whose purpose had been rehearsed thousands of times, but never tested in this strange, airless world. The computer that guided them down toward the lunar surface was a marvel of 1960s engineering. 70 pounds of circuits and logic that somehow contained enough intelligence to navigate between worlds with pinpoint precision. It had less raw computing power than a modern pocket calculator, Yet it carried within its silicon memory the accumulated dreams and fears and desperate hopes of an entire species reaching toward something that had been impossible since the beginning of time. As you settle into this story, visualize the stark beauty rolling past outside Eagle's triangular windows. The lunar surface spread beneath them like a gray ocean frozen in time, its ancient craters and ridges unmarked by weather, unchanged for millions of years, waiting patiently for the first gentle touch of human presence. Somewhere in that cosmic desert of magnificent desolation, they would attempt to land. But first they had to solve problems that no one had fully anticipated. Challenges that existed in the narrow space between human ambition and the unforgiving laws of physics. Imagine the sounds of that moment as Eagle began its final descent. The whisper of oxygen flowing through life support systems, the subtle vibration of the descent engine burning steadily below them, the electronic hum of guidance computers working at the very edge of their capacity. The descent had been proceeding smoothly according to plan, each milestone checked off in the careful sequence that would either deliver them safely to the surface or require an immediate abort to preserve their lives. But then, in the span of a single heartbeat, the peace was shattered by a sound that made both astronauts' hearts skip and sent waves of concern rippling through mission control. The sharp, insistent chime of a computer alarm. Picture yourself walking through those tense seconds as program alarm crackled through the radio communications. Armstrong's voice carrying just the slightest edge of controlled concern across the 250,000-mile void. In the cramped cabin of Eagle, surrounded by switches and circuit breakers and the steady glow of instrument displays, Buzz Aldrin stared at the computer screen where 4 amber numbers had appeared like an unwelcome omen. 1202. Feel the weight of history around you as that simple 4-digit code triggered a cascade of urgent consultations in mission control. In the back rooms where the real decisions were made, far from the cameras and the carefully managed public image of space exploration, Jack Garman felt his pulse quicken as the alarm call echoed through the speakers. His hand moved instinctively toward the sheet of paper taped under glass on his desk. Months of careful study and preparation suddenly focused into this single, critical moment. And if you drift off here, nothing important will be missed. The story will carry on through the delicate balance of human judgment and machine precision that was guiding Eagle down toward the lunar surface. But there are secrets yet to be revealed, decisions made in split seconds that would echo through history, moments of private faith and public courage that transformed a technological achievement into something profoundly human. Meanwhile, somewhere in the distance of that same remarkable night, another drama was unfolding in the silence that would remain secret from the world for years to come. Carefully wrapped and tucked away in Buzz Aldrin's personal equipment kit, a small silver chalice waited alongside a packet of bread blessed at Webster Presbyterian Church outside Houston. They represented something that couldn't be quantified in mission timelines or technical specifications. The hope that even in the vastness of space, some things remain sacred and personal and beautifully human. Breathe deeply and let the years fade away to those crucial seconds when everything humanity had worked toward hung in the balance of a 24-year-old engineer's knowledge and a computer alarm that no one in the spacecraft fully understood. The 1202 code represented an overload condition, the guidance computer's way of saying it had more tasks to handle than time to complete them. But was it serious enough to abort the landing? Was it a warning of impending system failure, or simply the machine's equivalent of asking for a moment to catch its breath. Slowly, the scene shifts to Jack Garman's moment of truth, when years of preparation and study crystallized into a single word spoken quietly into his headset. Continue. That word would travel from his lips through the chain of command, from Guidance Officer Steve Bales to Flight Director Gene Kranz to Capsule Communicator Charlie Duke, and finally across the void to two men in a fragile spacecraft who needed to know whether to press forward with humanity's greatest adventure or abort and try again another day. But there was something else happening in those tense minutes, something that wouldn't become clear until much later. The computer alarms, while concerning, were actually the system working exactly as designed. The guidance computer was prioritizing its most critical functions, maintaining navigation and guidance while temporarily setting aside less essential tasks. It was, in its own silicon way, demonstrating the same kind of grace under pressure that the astronauts themselves were showing. You can let this moment blur softly, and the story will carry on through the careful choreography of technology and human skill that was bringing Eagle closer to its destination with each passing second. But the fuel gauge was becoming a source of growing concern, and ahead lay challenges that would test every system, every person, every decision made in the years of preparation leading to this moment. There will be nothing to solve right now, only the quiet passing of time as Eagle continued its descent through the thin vacuum above the lunar surface. The ancient regolith below waited patiently, as it had waited for billions of years, to feel the first gentle pressure of human footsteps. But getting there safely would require navigating not just the technical challenges of spaceflight, but the more subtle challenges of faith, courage, and the deeply human need to reach for something beyond the ordinary boundaries of existence. Still, one small piece didn't quite settle into place. The computer alarms had been resolved, but they were only the beginning of the challenges that lay ahead. Armstrong was beginning to realize that their planned landing site might not be as smooth and welcoming as the photographs had suggested, and the fuel that would carry them safely to the surface was being consumed second by precious second. The real test of this remarkable night was still to come, waiting just ahead in the shadows and sunlight of an alien landscape that had never known the presence of life. And yet, something about it felt unfinished in the gentlest way. The technical challenges were manageable, the crew was performing flawlessly, and Mission Control was providing exactly the support and guidance needed to ensure success. But there were human elements to this story that transcended mere technological achievement. Moments of private devotion, personal faith, and quiet courage that would transform this landing from a triumph of engineering into something that touched the very essence of what it means to be human in a vast and mysterious universe. And in that calm uncertainty, the night kept moving forward, carrying Eagle and its precious cargo closer to a rendezvous with history that would change humanity's understanding of its place in the cosmos forever. Let yourself drift back to that winter night when the ordinary rules of gravity and possibility had been suspended by human ingenuity and courage. In the weeks leading up to this moment, thousands of people had worked around the clock, their lives consumed by the intricate details that would either deliver 3 human beings safely to another world or condemn them to become the first casualties of humanity's greatest adventure. Engineers had calculated trajectories with slide rules and early computers. Seamstresses had hand-sewn spacesuits designed to protect human life in the vacuum of space. and technicians had assembled rockets with the power to escape Earth's gravitational embrace. Picture yourself walking through the corridors of NASA during those final months of preparation, when the weight of national prestige and human dreams rested on every decision, every calculation, every carefully crafted component that would carry Eagle toward its destination. The Apollo guidance computer alone represented millions of hours of programming and testing, its software woven by hand into rope memory by women working with the precision of medieval illuminators, each wire carrying crucial instructions that would guide the spacecraft through the darkness between worlds. Feel the weight of history around you as we consider the broader context of this remarkable night. The Cold War competition that had sparked the race to the moon was giving way to something more profound. A recognition that this achievement belonged not to any single nation, but to the entire human species. Radio telescopes around the world were tracking Eagle's progress, from the massive dishes at Jodrell Bank in England to smaller installations in Australia and Japan. Even in countries officially opposed to American space efforts, people were gathering around television sets and radios, drawn by the universal appeal of exploration and discovery. The lunar module itself was a testament to the marriage of engineering precision and industrial artistry that characterized the Apollo program. Every component had been designed and tested to withstand the harsh environment of space. The extreme temperature variations from -250 degrees in shadow to +250 degrees in sunlight. The constant bombardment of cosmic radiation. The perfect vacuum that would boil human blood in seconds without the protection of a pressure suit. Yet inside this mechanical marvel, two human beings were experiencing the adventure with all the ordinary concerns and fears and hopes that defined human experience throughout history. As you settle into this story, visualize the complex choreography of mission control during these critical minutes. Behind the main flight director's console, dozens of specialists monitored everything from electrical power consumption to waste management systems. The environmental control and life support engineer tracked oxygen and carbon dioxide levels with the precision of a physician monitoring a patient's vital signs. The retrofire officer calculated backup plans for emergency returns to Earth if something went catastrophically wrong during the landing attempt. Imagine the sounds of mission control during these final minutes of approach. The subtle electronic whisper of radio communications filtered through amplifiers and speakers. The rustle of paper as controllers checked their procedures against carefully prepared flight plans. The occasional cough or whispered conversation between engineers consulting their technical manuals. Behind it all, the steady hum of air conditioning and computers working at full capacity, processing streams of data from instruments mounted throughout Eagle's systems. But there were human elements to this story that no amount of technical preparation could fully capture. Buzz Aldrin, whose role during the landing sequence was to monitor instruments and call out altitude and velocity readings, was also thinking about what waited in his personal kit once they touched down safely. The communion elements he'd brought seemed simultaneously profound and absurd. Sacred bread and wine traveling through the vacuum of space to a world where nothing had ever lived, where the very concept of communion would take on meanings no theologian had ever contemplated. Slowly, the scene shifts to the theological preparations that had preceded this moment. Conversations between Aldrin and his pastor at Webster Presbyterian Church about the appropriateness of celebrating communion on the moon. The bread had been blessed in a simple ceremony, attended by only a few close friends and family members. The wine poured into a miniature chalice specially designed to function in the low-gravity environment of the lunar surface. These preparations had been made quietly, without publicity, partly due to NASA's concerns about legal challenges from groups opposed to religious expression in government-sponsored activities. Time moves like honey as we travel through the layers of secrecy and discretion that surrounded Aldrin's plans for lunar communion. The space agency was still dealing with legal challenges stemming from the Apollo 8 crew's reading of Genesis during their Christmas Eve broadcast from lunar orbit the previous year. Atheist activist Madeleine Murray O'Hair had filed suit claiming the reading violated the constitutional separation of church and state, and NASA administrators were nervous about any additional religious controversy that might complicate their already complex relationship with Congress and the American public. Let yourself drift back to that winter night when faith and science were finding common ground in the most unlikely place imaginable. Aldrin's communion plans represented something that transcended the technical achievement of lunar landing, a recognition that human beings carried more than just scientific instruments and survival equipment into space. They carried their deepest beliefs, their most profound hopes, their need to find meaning and connection even in the vast emptiness between worlds. Meanwhile, somewhere in the distance back on Earth, families and friends of the astronauts were living through their own version of this historic night. Joan Aldrin waited at home with her children, trying to maintain normal routines, while her husband attempted something that had never been done before. Pat Collins prepared for what could be either celebration or tragedy, knowing that her husband Mike was orbiting the moon alone, ready to return to Earth as either a hero or the sole survivor of humanity's greatest adventure gone wrong. You can let this moment blur softly, and the story will carry on through the careful balance of technology and human courage that was bringing Eagle closer to its rendezvous with the lunar surface. But the fuel situation was becoming increasingly critical, each second of continued flight consuming the propellant that represented the narrow margin between success and catastrophe. Breathe deeply and let the years fade away to those crucial moments when the 12:02 alarm was just the beginning of the challenges that lay ahead. Armstrong was beginning to study the terrain below with growing concern, realizing that their carefully planned landing site might not be as smooth and welcoming as orbital photographs had suggested. The lunar surface, seen from this close range for the first time in human history, revealed details that no telescope or robotic probe could have detected. There will be nothing to solve right now, only the steady progression of events that had been set in motion by decades of preparation and centuries of human dreams about reaching beyond Earth's boundaries. But the real test of this remarkable night was still ahead, waiting in the shadows and harsh sunlight of an alien landscape that would soon feel the gentle pressure of human footsteps for the first time in its 4.5 billion-year history. Picture yourself walking through those final seconds before the next alarm would sound, when everything seemed under control, but uncertainty lurked just beneath the surface of technical precision. The guidance computer continued its complex calculations, steering Eagle through the three-dimensional maze of gravitational forces and orbital mechanics that governed motion in space. But computers, no matter how sophisticated, could not account for every variable, could not predict every challenge that human pilots might encounter as they attempted to land on a world that had been studied but never truly explored. And perhaps the answer didn't need to arrive tonight. The moon had waited patiently for this moment through geological ages that dwarfed human history, through the rise and fall of species and continents and ice ages. A few more minutes of careful navigation seemed insignificant against that cosmic timescale. But for the people watching and waiting and making split-second decisions in rooms filled with the amber glow of electronic displays, every second stretched like an eternity, pregnant with possibilities both wonderful and terrible. Still, one small piece didn't quite settle into place, like a puzzle with a missing corner that prevented complete understanding. The computer alarms had been resolved through Jack Garman's careful preparation and quick thinking. But they were only the first in a series of challenges that would test every aspect of the mission planning and crew training that had brought humanity to this point. The real drama of this night was only beginning to unfold, waiting just ahead in the interplay between human skill and mechanical precision that would determine whether Eagle landed safely or became a monument to the risks inherent in reaching beyond the comfortable boundaries of Earth. The silence stretched like a held breath between worlds. Picture yourself walking through the final minutes before everything changed, when the careful choreography of spaceflight gave way to the raw improvisation of human survival instinct. The 12:02 alarm had been resolved, but now Eagle faced challenges that no simulation could have perfectly predicted, problems that existed in the narrow space between engineering calculations and the unforgiving reality of alien terrain. In the cramped cabin of the lunar module, Neil Armstrong was discovering that landing on the moon bore little resemblance to the hundreds of practice sessions he'd completed in simulators back on Earth. The computer had guided them beautifully through the initial descent, but now, in these final crucial minutes, he realized they were heading directly toward a boulder field, a chaotic landscape of rocks the size of automobiles scattered across what orbital photographs had suggested would be a relatively smooth landing site. Feel the weight of history around you as Armstrong made the decision that would define the remainder of the landing sequence. His gloved hands moved carefully on the attitude controller, the joystick that would allow him to override the computer's planned trajectory and search for a safer landing spot. Below Eagle, shadows cast by the low lunar sun created a stark chiaroscuro pattern across the ancient surface, every shadow potentially concealing a crater deep enough to swallow their spacecraft, every bright patch possibly hiding loose regolith that might shift under the weight of their landing legs. The fuel gauge had become a source of increasingly urgent concern. Mission rules were absolutely clear on this point. If they didn't land with at least 25 seconds of fuel remaining in the descent stage, they had to abort immediately, fire the ascent engine, and attempt to rendezvous with Mike Collins in the command module orbiting overhead. Nobody in Mission Control wanted to discuss what would happen if that rendezvous failed. Some possibilities were too terrible to voice over open radio channels that might be monitored by families and reporters around the world. As you settle into this story, visualize the view from Eagle's triangular windows during these heart-stopping minutes. The lunar landscape rolled beneath them like a frozen ocean of gray dust and ancient rock, its surface unmarked by wind or water, unchanged for millions of years, except for the occasional impact of meteorites that added new craters to a surface already saturated with the scars of cosmic bombardment. From this altitude, individual boulders stood out like monuments in a vast cemetery, each one a potential obstacle that could end humanity's first attempt at lunar landing in catastrophe. Let yourself drift back to that winter night when time seemed suspended between success and disaster. In Mission Control, dozens of specialists watched their consoles with the focused intensity of surgeons performing a complex operation. The flight dynamics officer tracked Eagle's trajectory with mathematical precision, calculating fuel consumption rates against distance remaining and time elapsed. The guidance officer monitored the computer systems that were helping Armstrong navigate through this three-dimensional maze of gravitational forces and orbital mechanics. Imagine the sounds of mission control during these critical minutes. The steady electronic hum of computers processing streams of telemetry data from Eagle's instruments. The whispered consultations between engineers checking their calculations against predetermined abort criteria. The occasional rustle of paper as controllers updated their logbooks with real-time observations. Behind it all, the subtle whisper of air conditioning systems working to maintain comfortable temperatures in a room where the psychological pressure was becoming almost unbearable. Time moves like honey as we travel through the layers of complexity that surrounded this seemingly simple task of landing a spacecraft on solid ground. Every aspect of Eagle's descent was governed by physics equations that balanced thrust against gravity, fuel consumption against time remaining, navigation accuracy against the need for manual pilot inputs. The margin for error was measured in seconds and inches, with no room for significant mistakes or mechanical failures. Slowly, the scene shifts to the moment when Armstrong first spotted what he was looking for. A relatively clear area beyond the boulder field, perhaps large enough to accommodate Eagle's 14-foot landing pad spread, smooth enough to provide stable support for a spacecraft that weighed 15 tons in Earth gravity, but only 2.5 tons in the Moon's weaker gravitational field. Getting there, however, would require precious seconds of additional flight time, precious fuel that would bring them dangerously close to the abort threshold that represented the difference between success and survival. 60 seconds, came the terse call from Mission Control, the voice of Jack Garman cutting through the radio static with surgical precision. 60 seconds of fuel remaining before they would have to abort the landing and try to return to the command module. In the world of spaceflight, 60 seconds could be an eternity or an instant, depending entirely on what needed to be accomplished in that span of time. Breathe deeply and let the years fade away to those crucial moments when Armstrong's test pilot instincts took complete control of the situation. Years of flying experimental aircraft, of pushing machines and human reflexes to their absolute limits, had prepared him for exactly this kind of improvisation under pressure. His hands moved with unconscious precision on the controls, steering Eagle across the lunar surface at an altitude that would have been terrifyingly low in Earth's atmosphere, but felt almost sedate in the airless environment of the Moon. Meanwhile, somewhere in the distance of the same remarkable night, another kind of preparation was taking place in the silence of Eagle's equipment bay. The communion elements that Buzz Aldrin had carried from Webster Presbyterian Church waited patiently in his personal kit, wrapped in protective packaging and secured against the vibrations and accelerations of spaceflight. They represented something that transcended the technical achievement of lunar landing, a recognition that human beings carried their deepest beliefs and most profound hopes into even the most extraordinary circumstances. You can let this moment blur softly, and the story will carry on through the delicate balance of human judgment and mechanical precision that was bringing Eagle closer to its appointment with the lunar surface. But the tension in Mission Control was reaching levels that tested the emotional endurance of everyone involved. Flight directors who had guided America through dozens of space missions were experiencing stress unlike anything they had encountered before. Picture yourself walking through the back rooms of Mission Control, where specialists worked in relative anonymity to support the more visible flight controllers. The environmental control and life support engineer monitored oxygen and carbon dioxide levels in Eagle's cabin with the precision of a physician tracking a patient's vital signs. The electrical and environmental command officer watched power consumption patterns, knowing that any unexpected drain on the spacecraft's batteries could compromise their ability to return safely to Earth. Feel the weight of history around you as the fuel situation became increasingly critical with each passing second. The descent engine was consuming propellant at a rate determined by the need to maintain controlled flight against lunar gravity while searching for a safe landing site. Every second of continued flight brought Eagle closer to the abort limit, but every second was also bringing them closer to the relatively smooth patch of terrain that Armstrong had spotted beyond the boulder field. There will be nothing to solve right now, only the steady progression of events that were testing every aspect of mission planning and crew training that had brought humanity to this point. In the spacecraft, Buzz Aldrin called out altitude and velocity readings with the calm precision of a professional pilot, his voice steady despite the knowledge that they were attempting something that had never been accomplished before, something that balanced on the knife's edge between triumph and tragedy. And if you drift off here, nothing important will be missed. The story will carry on through the careful dance of technology and human skill that was guiding Eagle through these final minutes of approach. But the real test of this remarkable night was still ahead, waiting in the harsh sunlight and deep shadows of an alien landscape that would soon experience the first gentle touch of human presence in its 4.5 billion-year history. Imagine the view from Mike Collins' perspective as he orbited the moon in the command module Columbia, alone but not lonely, carrying the responsibility of being the crew's only link to Earth during these critical minutes. Through his windows, the lunar surface passed in majestic silence, its ancient craters and mountain ranges a testament to the violent history of the early solar system. He knew that somewhere on that gray landscape below, his crewmates were attempting to land, but the moon's curvature and Eagle's low altitude meant he couldn't see them during this final phase of the descent. Still, one small piece didn't quite settle into place. The fuel calculations that had seemed adequate during mission planning were being stretched to their absolute limits by the need to search for a safe landing site. Every engineer and flight controller who had worked on fuel consumption estimates was silently recalculating their numbers, wondering if they had left sufficient margin for the kind of piloting challenges that Armstrong was now facing. 30 seconds, came the next call from Mission Control, and everyone who heard those words understood their significance. 30 seconds represented the absolute minimum fuel reserve required for a safe abort to lunar orbit. Any landing that consumed more than 30 additional seconds worth of fuel would leave Eagle without sufficient propellant to reach the altitude necessary for rendezvous with the command module. Let yourself drift back to that winter night when the impossible became routine through the application of human courage and technical precision. Armstrong's eyes moved constantly between the view outside Eagle's windows and the instruments on the console before him, integrating visual information about the lunar terrain with numerical data about altitude, velocity, and fuel consumption. The landing radar was providing continuous updates on their height above the surface, while the guidance computer maintained their orientation and controlled the descent engine's thrust level. Time moves like honey as we travel through these final seconds of approach, when years of preparation and training crystallized into a few moments of pure concentration and skill. The lunar module was designed to land automatically, guided by its computer systems. But real-world conditions had required human intervention, human judgment, and human piloting skill that no machine could replicate. Slowly, the scene shifts to the moment when Eagle finally reached the altitude where Armstrong could clearly see the surface details that would determine their fate. The regolith, the layer of fine dust and rock fragments created by millions of years of meteorite impacts, appeared smooth enough to support their landing legs, but its actual consistency remained unknown. Would it be firm enough to provide stable support? Or would eagles sink into a deep layer of loose material that might trap them on the surface? And yet, something about it felt unfinished in the gentlest way. The technical challenges were being met with exactly the kind of skill and preparation that the Apollo program represented. But there were human elements to this story that transcended mere engineering achievement. The communion elements waiting in Buzz's personal kit, the families watching and waiting on Earth, the sense of representing not just American ambition, but human curiosity and courage. These elements would transform this landing from a technological triumph into something that touched the essence of what it meant to be human in a vast and mysterious universe. Not dangerous, just strangely incomplete without acknowledging the deeper significance of what was happening. This wasn't simply a demonstration of technical capability or national prestige. It was a moment when humanity reached beyond the comfortable boundaries of Earth and touched another world, carrying with them all the complexity and contradiction and beautiful imperfection that defined human nature throughout history. And in that calm uncertainty, the night kept moving toward its climax, carrying Eagle and its precious cargo through the final seconds of descent toward a landscape that would soon feel the gentle pressure of human footsteps for the first time. But first, they had to land safely, and that outcome was still balanced on the narrow margin between fuel consumption and piloting skill that would determine whether this night ended in celebration or catastrophe. Picture yourself walking through the psychological landscape of mission control during these final minutes, where the accumulated stress of years of preparation was focused into moments of almost unbearable tension. Flight Director Gene Kranz stood at his console with the bearing of a military commander directing a crucial battle, his white vest immaculate despite the emotional pressure that was testing everyone in the room. Around him, dozens of specialists monitored their individual systems with the focused intensity of musicians in a complex orchestra, each person responsible for one crucial element of the symphony that would either deliver the astronauts safely to the lunar surface or require an immediate abort to preserve their lives. The Capcom Charlie Duke, responsible for all communications with the crew, felt the weight of being the voice that would relay either good news or devastating information to the astronauts. His training had prepared him for routine communications, but nothing could have fully prepared him for the responsibility of potentially having to tell Neil Armstrong and Buzz Aldrin that they had to abort humanity's first attempt at lunar landing. Every word he spoke would be recorded for history, analyzed and remembered long after the immediate crisis had passed. Feel the weight of history around you as the fuel situation became the dominant factor in every calculation being made in mission control. The retrofire officer was continuously updating abort scenarios, calculating the precise moment when continued descent would become impossible without compromising Eagle's ability to return to lunar orbit. These calculations required split-second precision, balancing fuel consumption rates against time remaining, altitude above the surface against velocity toward the landing site. Let yourself drift back to that winter night when human judgment was being tested against the unforgiving mathematics of spaceflight. Every mission rule had been written based on careful analysis of what could go wrong and how much margin would be required for safe recovery. But real-world conditions had a way of testing those margins in ways that no simulation could perfectly predict. The boulder field that had forced Armstrong to search for an alternative landing site represented exactly the kind of challenge that mission planners had worried about but hoped they wouldn't encounter. The guidance computer continued its complex calculations throughout this manual flying phase, providing Armstrong with continuous updates on their velocity, altitude, and attitude relative to the lunar surface. But computers, no matter how sophisticated, could not make the visual judgments required to distinguish between a safe landing site and a potentially dangerous obstacle field. That kind of perception and decision-making required human eyes, human experience, and human intuition, developed through years of test piloting under challenging conditions. As you settle into this story, visualize the delicate interplay between man and machine that characterized this phase of the landing. Armstrong's control inputs were interpreted by the guidance computer and translated into precise thrust commands for the 16 small attitude control thrusters that maintained Eagle's orientation during descent. The descent engine itself was controlled automatically, its thrust level adjusted continuously to maintain the descent rate that would bring them safely to the surface, assuming they could find a suitable landing site before running out of fuel. Time moves like honey as we travel through the mathematical precision that governed every aspect of Eagle's flight profile. The trajectory that brought them from lunar orbit to the surface had been calculated months in advance, taking into account the gravitational field of the Moon, the rotation of both Earth and Moon, and the orbital mechanics that would allow the ascent stage to rendezvous with Mike Collins in the command module after the surface operations were completed. But now those carefully planned trajectories were being modified in real time by a pilot who was improvising solutions to problems that had never been fully anticipated. Imagine the complexity of the navigational challenge Armstrong was facing as he searched for a safe landing site. The lunar module was approaching the surface at an angle, not dropping straight down, which meant that every second of continued flight carried them across the landscape toward an uncertain destination. The fuel remaining in the descent stage was being consumed not just to control their vertical descent, but also to maintain forward motion as they searched for suitable terrain. Slowly, the scene shifts to the broader context of this historic moment, when hundreds of thousands of people around the world were following the mission through radio and television broadcasts. In Houston, families of NASA employees gathered in homes and community centers, listening to mission communications and trying to understand the technical details that would determine whether their friends and colleagues had successfully guided humanity to its first lunar landing. But there were aspects of this story that would remain hidden from public awareness for years to come. The communion elements in Buzz Aldrin's personal kit represented a dimension of human experience that had never been carried beyond Earth's atmosphere. The desire to find spiritual meaning and connection even in the most extraordinary circumstances. Webster Presbyterian Church had blessed those elements in a quiet ceremony attended by only a few family members and close friends, understanding that they were participating in something that transcended the boundaries of ordinary religious experience. Breathe deeply and let the years fade away to those crucial seconds when the phrase 20 seconds crackled through the radio communications from Mission Control. 20 seconds of fuel remaining before mandatory abort, the absolute minimum reserve required for Eagle's ascent stage to reach the altitude and velocity necessary for rendezvous with the command module. Everyone who heard those words understood their significance. This was the moment when years of preparation and billions of dollars in investment would either result in success or require an immediate retreat to preserve the astronauts' lives. You can let this moment blur softly, and the story will carry on through the final seconds of humanity's first approach to another world. But the tension in Eagle's cabin was balanced by the professional calm that characterized both astronauts' response to this unprecedented challenge. Armstrong's hands moved with the precision developed through thousands of hours of flight training, while Aldrin continued his steady stream of altitude and velocity callouts, providing the numerical information that Armstrong needed to integrate with his visual observations of the terrain below. There will be nothing to solve right now. Only the steady progression of events that were testing every aspect of human spaceflight capability. The descent engine continued burning steadily, consuming the propellant that represented their only means of controlled flight in the airless environment of the Moon. Unlike atmospheric flight, where pilots could glide to emergency landings if their engines failed, lunar landing required continuous engine operation until the moment of touchdown. Still, one small piece didn't quite settle into place, like a symphony with one final note that remained to be played. The lunar landing had accomplished everything that President Kennedy had promised when he announced the goal of reaching the Moon before the end of the decade. But it had also revealed how much remained to be learned and accomplished before humanity could truly consider itself a spacefaring civilization capable of surviving and thriving beyond Earth. The 3 astronauts who had carried out this historic mission returned to Earth as changed men, carrying within their memories experiences that no human beings had ever had before, and perspectives on existence that could only be gained through the ultimate travel experience of visiting another world. Their photographs, descriptions, and personal testimonies would continue to inspire new generations of explorers for decades to come. Not dangerous, just strangely incomplete without acknowledging that the successful lunar landing represented both an ending and a beginning. It marked the conclusion of the most ambitious exploration project in human history. But it also demonstrated that human beings possessed capabilities that could be applied to even more challenging goals if they were willing to commit the necessary resources and maintain their dedication over the extended periods required for truly transformative achievements. And yet, something about it felt unfinished, in the gentlest way that all great achievements carry within them the seeds of even greater accomplishments that lie waiting in the future. The successful lunar landing had proved that humanity could reach beyond Earth to touch other worlds, but it had also revealed the vast distances and enormous challenges that separated human beings from the cosmic frontier that beckoned with promises of discoveries and adventures that could not yet be fully imagined. And in that calm uncertainty, the legacy of Apollo 11 continues to inspire new generations of dreamers and explorers who believe that humanity's future lies not just on the small blue planet where life first emerged, but throughout the vast universe that surrounds Earth like an ocean of infinite possibility, waiting for the day when human consciousness will spread among the stars and establish civilization on worlds that have never known the touch of life until Earth's children finally arrive to make them home. Time moves like honey as we travel through the profound implications of what had been achieved during this remarkable week in human history. The successful lunar landing and safe return represented more than a victory in the Cold War competition with the Soviet Union, or a demonstration of American technological capabilities. They marked a fundamental transition in human history, the moment when Earth's children first reached beyond their home planet and established direct contact with the cosmic environment that surrounded them. Imagine the complexity of the psychological adjustment that awaited the crew as they prepared to return to a world where their extraordinary experiences would seem almost impossible to communicate to people who had never left Earth's surface. How could they describe the sensation of walking in 1/6 gravity, or the profound silence of the lunar vacuum, or the overwhelming beauty of Earth seen from the perspective of another world? The command module that carried them home had been their entire universe for most of the mission, a small bubble of Earth atmosphere and familiar technology that had sustained human life during the journey to the Moon and back. But it was also cramped, noisy, and filled with the accumulated debris of a week-long spaceflight, making the astronauts eager to feel solid ground beneath their feet and breathe air that hadn't been recycled through mechanical life support systems. Slowly, the scene shifts to the splashdown in the Pacific Ocean that marked the successful completion of humanity's first journey to another world. The spacecraft that had carried them safely across the void between Earth and Moon settled gently into the ocean waters, supported by parachutes that had performed exactly as designed, despite the stress of re-entering Earth's atmosphere at 25,000 miles per hour. But the crew's return to Earth was complicated by concerns about possible contamination by unknown lunar organisms. Though scientists believed the Moon to be sterile, NASA had implemented strict quarantine procedures that would isolate the astronauts for 21 days after their return. They were transferred directly from the command module to a mobile quarantine facility that would carry them to the Lunar Receiving Laboratory in Houston, where they would remain isolated until any theoretical lunar microorganisms could have manifested themselves. Breathe deeply and let the years fade away to those remarkable weeks when the whole world celebrated humanity's greatest adventure, while the crew remained isolated in quarantine facilities designed to protect Earth from possible contamination. The irony was not lost on anyone. The heroes of humanity's greatest exploration were prevented from sharing their triumph directly with the people who had made their achievement possible. You can let this moment blur softly, and the story will carry on through the aftermath of an achievement that would influence human consciousness for generations to come. But the successful lunar landing represented only the beginning of humanity's expansion into space, the first chapter in a story that might eventually span the galaxy and transform human understanding of its place in the cosmic order. The samples collected from the Sea of Tranquility would be analyzed in laboratories around the world for decades, revealing information about the formation of the Moon, the early history of the solar system, and the processes that had shaped planetary evolution throughout the cosmos. These materials, preserved in the airless environment of the Moon for billions of years, contain scientific treasures that could not be found anywhere else in the solar system. There will be nothing to solve right now. Only the gentle recognition that humanity had successfully accomplished something that had been dreamed about for millennia, but achieved only through the concentrated effort of hundreds of thousands of people working together toward a common goal. The lunar landing belonged not just to the astronauts who had carried out the mission, but to everyone who had contributed to making this extraordinary achievement possible. Picture yourself walking through the broader implications of what had been accomplished during this historic mission. The successful landing demonstrated that human beings possessed the technical capability and organizational skill to undertake projects of unprecedented complexity and ambition. If humanity could reach the Moon, what other seemingly impossible goals might become achievable through similar applications of knowledge, determination, and international cooperation? The communion service that Buzz Aldrin had conducted in private on the lunar surface would eventually become known as one of the most remarkable religious ceremonies in human history, adding a profound spiritual dimension to humanity's first contact with another world. The bread and wine that had been blessed for this purpose at Webster Presbyterian Church had traveled farther from Earth than any religious elements had ever gone before, creating a bridge between ancient spiritual traditions and humanity's expansion into the cosmic frontier. Feel the weight of history around you as we consider the legacy of this extraordinary achievement. The footprints left in the lunar regolith by Armstrong and Aldrin would remain undisturbed for millions of years, waiting for future explorers who might return to this same landing site, carrying more sophisticated equipment and staying for longer periods to conduct more extensive scientific investigations. Let yourself drift back to that winter night when the impossible became routine through the application of human courage ingenuity, and determination. The successful lunar landing opened possibilities that had previously existed only in the realm of science fiction: permanent lunar bases, missions to Mars and other planets. Eventually, perhaps, the establishment of human settlements throughout the solar system and beyond to other stars. The technological innovations developed for the Apollo program would find applications throughout human society, from miniaturized electronics and advanced materials to life support systems and navigation computers. The investment in lunar exploration would yield dividends in improved technology, scientific knowledge, and human capability that would benefit people for generations to come. Meanwhile, somewhere in the distance of the years that followed, other nations would develop their own space exploration capabilities, creating an international community of spacefaring countries that would eventually collaborate on projects even more ambitious than the lunar landing. The dream of reaching beyond Earth would inspire people of all nations and cultures, transcending the political divisions that had originally motivated the race to the moon. And if you drift off here, nothing important will be missed. The story of Apollo 11 had reached its successful conclusion, but it represented only the first chapter in humanity's expansion into space. Future missions would go farther, accomplish more, and perhaps eventually establish permanent human presence beyond Earth, fulfilling the promise of this first tentative step toward the stars. Time moves like honey as we travel through the enduring significance of what was accomplished during that remarkable summer week in 1969. The successful lunar landing demonstrated that human beings could work together to achieve goals that seemed impossible when first proposed, inspiring generations of explorers, scientists, and dreamers to reach for achievements that previous generations could never have imagined. Still, one small piece didn't quite settle into place. The lunar landing had been accomplished with technology and techniques that would seem primitive compared to the capabilities that future generations would develop. What might be achieved when humanity possessed more advanced propulsion systems, life support technology, and scientific instruments? How far might human exploration eventually reach into the cosmic frontier that surrounded Earth? The three astronauts who had carried out this historic mission would become symbols of human achievement and ambassadors for the continuing exploration of space. Their experiences on and around the moon would influence their perspectives for the rest of their lives, providing them with insights into the beauty and fragility of Earth that could only be gained through the perspective of seeing their home planet from the distance of another world. Not dangerous, just strangely incomplete without acknowledging that this achievement represented only the beginning of humanity's journey into space. The successful lunar landing had proved that human beings could survive and work in the alien environment of other worlds, but it had also revealed how much remained to be learned and accomplished before humanity could truly consider itself a spacefaring civilization. And yet, something about it felt unfinished in the gentlest way. The brief visit to the moon had provided tantalizing glimpses of what human exploration could accomplish beyond Earth. But it had also demonstrated the enormous challenges and costs associated with sending people to other worlds. Future progress would require sustained commitment, international cooperation, and technological innovations that might take decades or centuries to develop and implement. And in that calm uncertainty, the story of humanity's greatest adventure draws to a close. But the dream of reaching beyond Earth continues to inspire new generations of explorers who will someday carry human consciousness to destinations that the Apollo astronauts could only imagine. The footprints in the lunar dust remain undisturbed, waiting patiently for the day when they will be joined by others as humanity takes its next steps toward the stars. The journey that began with 3 men in a spacecraft has become a legacy that belongs to all humanity, a demonstration that people can accomplish extraordinary things when they work together toward common goals that transcend national boundaries and cultural differences. The moon that once seemed impossibly distant has become a destination that human beings have visited, explored, and safely returned from to share their discoveries with the world. If you've enjoyed traveling back to that remarkable night in 1969, when humanity first reached beyond Earth to touch another world, I hope you'll consider subscribing to continue exploring the hidden stories and forgotten moments that shaped American history. There are countless other adventures waiting to be discovered in the quiet hours between sleeping and waking. Tales of courage and ingenuity that reveal the extraordinary dimensions of ordinary human experience. Until next time, sleep well and dream of the stars that await humanity's return. Picture yourself walking through the years that followed this extraordinary achievement, when the successful lunar landing inspired a generation of young people to pursue careers in science, engineering, and exploration. The images of human beings walking on another world became iconic symbols of what humanity could accomplish when it dedicated itself to seemingly impossible goals, demonstrating that the boundaries of the possible were far more flexible than previous generations had imagined. The technological innovations developed for the Apollo program found applications throughout society, from the miniaturized electronics that would eventually become personal computers to the advanced materials that improved everything from athletic equipment to medical devices. The investment in space exploration yielded dividends that extended far beyond the immediate scientific and symbolic value of landing on the moon, contributing to economic growth and technological advancement that benefited people around the world. Feel the weight of history around you as we consider the environmental perspective that the Apollo astronauts brought back from their journey. The photographs of Earth taken from the moon revealed humanity's home planet as a small blue marble hanging in the vast darkness of space, alone and vulnerable in a cosmos that seemed both beautiful and hostile to human life. This perspective on Earth's isolation and fragility would contribute to the growing environmental awareness that emerged during the following decades. The communion service that Buzz Aldrin had conducted in private on the lunar surface would eventually be revealed as one of the most remarkable religious ceremonies in human history. But it would also raise questions about the appropriate role of spiritual expression in government-sponsored space exploration. Future missions would need to balance the deeply personal spiritual needs of astronauts with the requirement that publicly funded space activities respect the religious diversity of the populations that supported them through their tax contributions. Let yourself drift back to that winter night when the impossible became routine. But the full implications of this achievement would only become clear as humanity developed more ambitious plans for space exploration. The successful lunar landing demonstrated that people could survive and work in the alien environment of other worlds. But it also revealed the enormous costs and risks associated with sending human beings beyond Earth's protective atmosphere. As you settle into this story, visualize the ticker tape parades and international celebrations that welcomed the Apollo 11 crew back to Earth after their quarantine period had been completed. The astronauts became global celebrities and ambassadors for space exploration, traveling around the world to share their experiences and inspire new generations of explorers who might someday carry human consciousness even farther into the cosmic frontier that surrounded Earth. Time moves like honey as we travel through the complex legacy of an achievement that transformed human understanding of what was possible when people worked together toward common goals that transcended national boundaries and political differences. The lunar landing had been accomplished during a period of intense Cold War competition, but its success demonstrated that human beings possessed capabilities that could be applied to challenges far more significant than military or political conflicts. The scientific samples collected from the Sea of Tranquility continued to yield new discoveries for decades after the mission's completion. Analysis of lunar materials revealed information about the formation of the Moon, the early history of the solar system, and the processes that had shaped planetary evolution throughout the cosmos. These discoveries contributed to humanity's understanding of its place in the universe and the conditions that had made life possible on Earth. Imagine the inspiration that this achievement provided to young people who grew up during the space age, when landing on the Moon had transformed from an impossible dream into documented historical reality. Many of these individuals would pursue careers in science, technology, engineering, and mathematics, contributing to innovations that would continue the work begun by the Apollo program and extend human capabilities even further into space. The engineering challenges that had been overcome during the development of the Apollo program created a foundation of knowledge and capability that would support all future space exploration efforts. The techniques developed for life support systems, navigation computers, and spacecraft design would be refined and improved, but the basic principles established during the lunar landing program would continue to guide human expansion beyond Earth for generations to come. Slowly, the scene shifts to the international cooperation that would eventually characterize space exploration. As the Cold War competition that had originally motivated the race to the Moon gave way to collaborative efforts that pooled the resources and expertise of multiple nations. The successful lunar landing had demonstrated that space exploration was too important and too expensive to be limited to the efforts of any single country, no matter how wealthy or technologically advanced. But there were also lessons about the limitations of human space exploration that emerged from the Apollo program's eventual conclusion. The costs and risks of sending people to other worlds were so enormous that sustained exploration would require levels of international cooperation and long-term commitment that proved difficult to maintain as political priorities shifted and public attention moved to other concerns. Breathe deeply and let the years fade away to those remarkable decades when the dream of space exploration competed with earthly problems for public attention and government funding. The successful lunar landing had proved that humanity possessed the technical capability to reach other worlds, but it had also revealed the enormous resources required to sustain such ambitious undertakings over the extended periods necessary to establish permanent human presence beyond Earth. You can let this moment blur softly, and the story will carry on through the legacy of an achievement that continues to inspire new generations of explorers and dreamers who believe that humanity's future lies not just on Earth, but throughout the solar system and eventually among the stars. The footprints left in the lunar dust by Armstrong and Aldrin remain undisturbed, waiting for the day when they will be joined by others as humanity takes its next steps toward becoming a truly spacefaring civilization. The space shuttles that followed the Apollo program would make orbital flight more routine and economical, but they would not return human beings to the lunar surface or carry them to more distant destinations like Mars. The International Space Station would demonstrate the possibility of long-term human habitation in space, but it would orbit only a few hundred miles above Earth, still well within the protective embrace of the planet's magnetic field and gravitational influence. There will be nothing to solve right now, only the gentle recognition that the achievement we have been exploring together represents both the culmination of one chapter in human history and the beginning of another that continues to unfold in ways that the Apollo astronauts could never have predicted. The dream of space exploration has evolved and adapted to changing circumstances, but it has never disappeared entirely from human consciousness. Picture yourself walking through the continuing influence of the Apollo program on contemporary space exploration efforts. The private companies that are now developing new spacecraft and launch vehicles trace their inspiration directly back to the achievements of the lunar landing program, while government space agencies around the world continue to build on the foundation of knowledge and capability that was established during that remarkable decade of the 1960s. Feel the weight of history around you as we consider the ways that the successful lunar landing changed humanity's understanding of its own potential. The achievement demonstrated that people could accomplish goals that seemed impossible when first proposed, providing a template for approaching other challenges that required unprecedented levels of international cooperation, technological innovation, and sustained commitment to long-term objectives. Let yourself drift back to that winter night when 3 human beings carried the dreams and hopes of an entire species on a journey that transformed fantasy into reality. Their success opened possibilities that previous generations could never have imagined, while also revealing the enormous challenges that would need to be overcome before humanity could establish permanent settlements beyond Earth. The lunar samples that were brought back to Earth remain some of the most precious scientific materials ever collected, stored in specially designed facilities, and analyzed using increasingly sophisticated instruments that reveal new information about planetary formation and cosmic evolution with each passing year. These materials represent a permanent legacy of humanity's first visit to another world, providing researchers with scientific treasures that will continue to yield discoveries for generations to come. Meanwhile, somewhere in the distance of future decades and centuries, new generations of explorers will build on the foundation established by the Apollo program to carry human consciousness farther into space than Armstrong, Aldrin, and Collins could ever have imagined. The moon that they visited briefly in 1969 may someday support permanent human settlements, while Mars and other destinations throughout the solar system become accessible to ordinary people rather than just highly trained astronauts. And if you drift off here, nothing important will be missed. The story of Apollo 11 has reached its conclusion, but the larger story of human expansion into space continues to unfold through the efforts of new generations of explorers who are inspired by the achievements of those who came before them. The dream of reaching beyond Earth has become a permanent part of human consciousness, waiting for the right combination of technology, resources, and political will to make the next great leap forward. Time moves like honey as we travel through the enduring significance of what was accomplished during that remarkable week in the summer of 1969. The successful lunar landing provided humanity with proof that seemingly impossible dreams could become reality through the application of knowledge, determination, and the willingness to take risks in pursuit of goals that transcended ordinary human experience. The ascent from the lunar surface would present new challenges and risks that were different from, but equally demanding as those encountered during the landing sequence. The upper stage of the lunar module had never been tested in actual lunar conditions, and its performance during the critical ascent burn would determine whether the crew could successfully rendezvous with Mike Collins in the command module orbiting overhead. Meanwhile, somewhere in the distance of lunar orbit, Collins continued his solitary vigil, maintaining the command module's systems and preparing for the rendezvous that would reunite the crew for their journey back to Earth. His isolation during the surface operations had been complete during periods when Columbia passed behind the Moon, cutting off radio communications with both Earth and the surface crew. And if you drift off here, nothing important will be missed. The surface operations had been completed successfully. The scientific objectives had been accomplished, and the crew was preparing for the next phase of their mission. But the most critical moments still lay ahead, when the ascent stage would have to perform flawlessly to carry them safely away from the lunar surface and back toward their appointment with Earth. Time moves like honey as we travel through the profound implications of what had just been accomplished. Human beings had successfully landed on another world, conducted scientific investigations on its surface, and demonstrated that the technology existed to support human life and activity beyond Earth. The achievement belonged not just to the astronauts who had carried out the mission, but to the thousands of engineers, scientists, and technicians whose work had made this moment possible. Still, one small piece didn't quite settle into place. The surface operations had been completed according to plan, but they represented only the beginning of humanity's exploration of the Moon and eventual expansion into the solar system. Future missions would need to accomplish much more: longer surface stays, more extensive geological investigations, and perhaps the establishment of permanent research stations that could support sustained human presence on the lunar surface. The samples collected during this first moonwalk would be studied for decades, revealing information about the formation of the Moon, the early history of the solar system, and the processes that had shaped planetary evolution throughout the cosmos. But they also raised new questions that could only be answered by additional missions carrying more sophisticated equipment and staying for longer periods on the lunar surface. Not dangerous, just strangely incomplete without acknowledging the broader significance of what had been accomplished. The successful moonwalk represented more than a victory in the Cold War competition with the Soviet Union, or a demonstration of American technological capabilities. It marked a fundamental transition in human history, the moment when Earth's children first reached beyond their home planet and established direct contact with the cosmic environment that surrounded them. And yet, something about it felt unfinished in the gentlest way. The surface operations had been completed successfully, but they were only a brief visit to a world that held countless mysteries and scientific treasures. The Moon would continue to beckon future explorers, promising discoveries that might revolutionize human understanding of planetary science, cosmic evolution, and the possibilities for life throughout the universe. And in that calm uncertainty, the crew prepared to leave behind the first human footprints on another world and begin their journey home, carrying with them samples of lunar material and memories of experiences that no human beings had ever had before. Picture yourself walking through the emotional complexity of those final moments on the lunar surface, when the astronauts faced the realization that they would soon have to leave this extraordinary place and might never return. The Moon had welcomed its first human visitors with magnificent desolation, offering them glimpses of cosmic beauty and scientific treasures that could not be found anywhere else in the solar system. The television cameras that had documented their activities captured some of the most iconic images in human history: ghostly figures moving in slow motion across an alien landscape. Human beings transformed by bulky pressure suits into otherworldly creatures that seemed to belong more to science fiction than reality. But the cameras could not capture the deeply personal emotions that the astronauts experienced as they prepared to conclude humanity's first visit to another world. Feel the weight of history around you as the crew worked through the carefully planned sequence of activities that would prepare Eagle for its departure from the lunar surface. Every piece of equipment had to be properly stowed, every sample container secured against the accelerations of ascent, every system checked and verified as ready to support the critical engine burn that would carry them away from the moon and back toward their rendezvous with the command module. The ascent stage of the lunar module represented one of the most remarkable spacecraft ever designed, a vehicle that existed for the sole purpose of launching two human beings from the surface of an airless world back into the vacuum of space where they could rendezvous with their colleague and begin the journey home. Its single engine would have to perform flawlessly since there was no backup system and no possibility of rescue if something went wrong. Let yourself drift back to that winter night when routine activities took on extraordinary significance simply because of where they were being performed. The post-moonwalk procedures that the crew was working through had been rehearsed hundreds of times in simulators, but this was the first time they were being performed in the actual environment of the lunar surface, where every action had to be carried out while wearing pressure suits that limited mobility and dexterity. As you settle into this story, visualize the scientific significance of the samples that were now carefully packed away in Eagle's storage compartments. The rocks and soil collected during the moonwalk contained information about the early history of the solar system that had been preserved in the airless, geologically inactive environment of the moon. These materials would be analyzed in laboratories around the world, providing insights into planetary formation processes that had long since been erased from Earth's surface. Time moves like honey as we travel through the layers of preparation required for the ascent from the lunar surface. The guidance computer that had helped them land safely would now need to calculate the precise trajectory required to reach the command module orbiting overhead. Any significant error in this calculation could result in the crew missing their rendezvous with Mike Collins, leaving them stranded in lunar orbit with no way to return to Earth. The lower descent stage of the lunar module would remain behind as a permanent monument to humanity's first landing on another world, its four legs marking the spot where people had first walked on the moon. The plaque attached to one of the landing legs carried a message that captured the universal significance of this achievement. Here men from the planet Earth first set foot upon the moon, July 1969 A.D. We came in peace for all mankind. Imagine the complexity of the emotional adjustment that the astronauts were experiencing as they prepared to leave the lunar surface. They had accomplished something that no human beings had ever done before, but they were also acutely aware of the risks that still lay ahead. The ascent engine had never been tested in actual lunar conditions, and its performance during the critical burn would determine whether they could successfully return to Earth or become permanent residents of the moon. Slowly, the scene shifts to mission control, where specialists were monitoring every aspect of the crew's preparation for ascent. The flight dynamics officer was calculating orbital mechanics with slide rule precision, determining the exact moment when Eagle would need to launch in order to rendezvous with the command module. The environmental control and life support engineer was tracking oxygen consumption and carbon dioxide levels, ensuring that the crew had adequate life support reserves for the ascent and rendezvous phases of the mission. The pressure suits that had allowed the astronauts to survive and work on the lunar surface were marvels of engineering that represented the culmination of decades of research into life support technology. Each suit was essentially a personal spacecraft, maintaining breathable atmosphere and protecting its wearer from the extreme temperature variations, vacuum conditions, and radiation exposure that characterized the lunar environment. Breathe deeply and let the years fade away to those crucial moments when the crew was making final preparations for departure from humanity's first outpost on another world. The lunar module's cabin, cramped and functional, had served as their base of operations during the surface stay, but it would soon become their launch vehicle for the journey back to lunar orbit and eventual return to Earth. You can let this moment blur softly, and the story will carry on through the final checks and preparations that would either deliver the crew safely back to the command module or leave them stranded in the alien environment of the Moon. But the significance of what they had accomplished during their brief visit to the lunar surface would resonate throughout human history, regardless of what challenges still lay ahead. The communion service that Buzz Aldrin had conducted in private after the landing had provided spiritual grounding for their surface operations. But the full meaning of that ceremony would only become apparent years later when the story was finally told to the public. The first food consumed on the Moon had been communion bread. The first liquid poured on another world had been wine blessed for a sacred purpose, adding a profound spiritual dimension to humanity's first visit to another world. There will be nothing to solve right now, only the careful progression of events that were carrying the crew toward the next critical phase of their mission. The ascent from the lunar surface would require precise timing, flawless engine performance, and exact navigation to reach the command module orbiting overhead. Any significant deviation from the planned trajectory could result in the crew missing their rendezvous opportunity and becoming stranded in lunar orbit. Picture yourself walking through the psychological preparation required for the astronauts as they faced the moment of truth for their return journey. They had successfully demonstrated that human beings could survive and work on the lunar surface, but the ascent phase would test their spacecraft and their own courage in ways that were different from, but equally challenging as those they had already overcome. Feel the weight of history around you as the crew prepared to activate the ascent stage engine for the first time in actual lunar conditions. The engine had been thoroughly tested on Earth, but the vacuum environment and reduced gravity of the Moon presented conditions that could not be perfectly simulated in any terrestrial facility. The engine would either perform flawlessly or fail catastrophically. There was no middle ground when launching from the surface of an airless world. Let yourself drift back to that winter night when human technology was being tested against the fundamental forces that governed motion in space. The orbital mechanics that would govern Eagle's ascent from the lunar surface were the same mathematical relationships that controlled planetary motion throughout the solar system. Equations that had been worked out by astronomers and mathematicians over the course of centuries. Meanwhile, somewhere in the distance of lunar orbit, Mike Collins continued his patient vigil in the command module Columbia, maintaining the spacecraft's systems and monitoring the radio frequencies that would carry word of Eagle's launch attempt. His role during the surface operations had been largely invisible to the public, but his contribution to the mission's success was absolutely essential for the crew's safe return to Earth. The rendezvous that would reunite the crew depended on split-second timing and mathematical precision that left no room for significant error. Eagle would need to launch at exactly the right moment, follow a precisely calculated trajectory, and arrive at exactly the right point in space where Columbia would be waiting. The margin for error was measured in seconds and miles, with no possibility of a second attempt if the first rendezvous failed. And if you drift off here, nothing important will be missed. The story will carry on through the critical moments when everything that had been accomplished during the mission would depend on the successful performance of systems that had never been tested under actual lunar conditions. But the crew was as well prepared as human knowledge and technology could make them, ready to face whatever challenges awaited during their ascent from the Moon. Time moves like honey, as we travel through the profound implications of what the crew had experienced during their brief stay on the lunar surface. They had become the first human beings to stand on another world and look back at Earth hanging like a blue marble in the black sky of space. This perspective on human existence had never been available to previous generations and would influence their understanding of humanity's place in the universe for the rest of their lives. Still, one small piece didn't quite settle into place. The surface operations had been completed successfully, the scientific samples had been collected, and the crew was preparing for ascent. But the most dangerous parts of their mission still lay ahead. The ascent engine would need to perform flawlessly. The rendezvous would need to be executed with mathematical precision, and the journey back to Earth would require that all spacecraft systems continue to function perfectly for several more days. The footprints that the astronauts were leaving behind in the lunar regolith would remain undisturbed for millions of years, preserved in the airless environment where no wind could erase them and no weather could wear them away. These marks of human passage would serve as permanent monuments to the courage and skill of the first people to visit another world, waiting patiently for future explorers who might return to this same landing site decades or centuries in the future. Not dangerous, just strangely incomplete without acknowledging the broader significance of what was about to happen. The ascent from the lunar surface would mark the end of humanity's first direct contact with another world, but it would also represent the beginning of an expansion into space that might eventually carry human consciousness throughout the solar system and beyond to the stars themselves. And yet, something about it felt unfinished in the gentlest way. The brief visit to the moon had provided tantalizing glimpses of what human exploration could accomplish beyond Earth. But it had also revealed how much remained to be discovered and understood about the cosmic environment that surrounded humanity's home planet. Future missions would need to go farther, stay longer, and accomplish much more before humanity could truly call itself a spacefaring civilization. And in that calm uncertainty, the moment approached when Eagle's ascent engine would either carry the crew safely back to lunar orbit or leave them permanently stranded on the surface of a world that had welcomed its first human visitors, but might not be so generous to those who failed to leave when the time came for departure. The engine ignited with a flame that no one could see. Picture yourself walking through that moment when silence gave way to the subdued roar of Eagle's ascent stage engine, carrying two human beings away from the surface of the moon and back toward the stars that had called to humanity since the beginning of consciousness. The lunar module's upper stage rose from its landing site with the graceful acceleration of a craft designed for the airless environment of space, leaving behind the lower descent stage as a permanent monument to humanity's first visit to another world. In the cramped cabin of the ascending spacecraft, Neil Armstrong and Buzz Aldrin felt the gentle push of acceleration as their remarkable vehicle climbed away from the Sea of Tranquility toward a rendezvous with Mike Collins in the command module orbiting overhead. The ascent engine was performing flawlessly, its single burn carrying them along a precisely calculated trajectory that would reunite the crew for their journey back to Earth. Feel the weight of history around you as the lunar surface fell away beneath Eagle, revealing the magnificent desolation of an ancient landscape that had remained unchanged for billions of years, until this brief moment when human beings had walked across its dust and rock. The footprints they were leaving behind would remain undisturbed for millions of years, preserved in the airless environment where no wind could erase them and no weather could wear them away. The rendezvous that followed unfolded with the mathematical precision that characterized all aspects of the Apollo program, a carefully choreographed ballet of orbital mechanics that brought two spacecraft together in the vast emptiness of lunar orbit. Collins had maintained his patient vigil alone in Columbia, ready to welcome his crewmates back for the journey that would carry them across the quarter-million-mile void between Moon and Earth. Let yourself drift back to that winter night when humanity was taking its first tentative steps toward becoming a multi-planetary species, carrying out activities that had been impossible since the beginning of time, but were now becoming routine through the application of human ingenuity and technological capability. The successful ascent from the lunar surface demonstrated that people could not only visit other worlds, but return safely to share their discoveries and experiences with the rest of humanity. As you settle into this story, visualize the moment when Eagle and Columbia docked together in lunar orbit, reuniting a crew that had been separated by the most extraordinary adventure in human history. The samples and photographs collected during the moonwalk were safely transferred to the command module, along with memories and experiences that would influence human understanding of its place in the universe for generations to come. The journey back to Earth began with another critical engine burn that would carry Columbia out of lunar orbit and onto a trajectory aimed at the distant blue marble that represented home, family, and everything familiar in a universe that had suddenly become much larger and more accessible than previous generations had ever imagined. The 3-day coast phase that followed allowed the crew to rest and reflect on what they had accomplished, while their spacecraft fell toward Earth with ever-increasing velocity. The pressure suits that would allow them to survive on the lunar surface represented marvels of engineering in their own right. Each suit, essentially a personal spacecraft designed to maintain human life in the vacuum of space. The helmets were equipped with gold-tinted visors to protect against the unfiltered solar radiation that could cause permanent eye damage in the airless environment of the Moon. The life support backpacks contained enough oxygen, water, and carbon dioxide removal capability to sustain human life for several hours of surface exploration. As you settle into this story, visualize the meticulous preparation required for humanity's first spacewalk on another world. Every tool that would be carried to the surface had been specially designed and tested for use in the extreme environment of the Moon. The cameras that would record historic images of human exploration had been modified to function in temperature extremes and vacuum conditions that would destroy ordinary photographic equipment. Time moves like honey as we travel through the layers of complexity that surrounded even the simplest activities planned for the lunar surface. The American flag that would be planted on the Moon had been specially treated to prevent degradation in the harsh solar radiation, and its pole had been designed with a telescoping mechanism that would allow it to be deployed quickly during the limited time available for surface operations. Imagine the psychological adjustment required for the astronauts as they prepared to become the first humans to walk on another world. The lunar surface, visible through Eagle's windows, looked both familiar and alien. Similar to Earth's desert landscapes in some ways, but utterly lifeless and marked by the violent history of meteorite impacts that had sculpted its surface over billions of years. No wind had ever blown across this landscape, no rain had ever fallen, no living thing had ever disturbed the ancient dust that covered its surface. Slowly, the scene shifts to mission control, where specialists were preparing for the unprecedented challenge of supporting human activities on the lunar surface. The Flight Activities Officer was coordinating with teams of scientists who had spent years planning the geological experiments that would be performed during the moonwalk. The surface operations would need to accomplish as much scientific investigation as possible during the limited time available, while also ensuring the safety of the crew and the successful completion of their primary objective. The communion service that Buzz Aldrin had just completed represented a dimension of human experience that had never been part of space missions before. The desire to find spiritual meaning in extraordinary circumstances. The bread he had consumed was the first food ever eaten on the moon. The wine, the first liquid ever poured on another world. These facts would remain largely unknown to the public for years, but they added a profound spiritual dimension to humanity's first landing on another world. Breathe deeply and let the years fade away to those remarkable hours when two human beings sat alone on the surface of the moon, separated from their home planet by 250,000 miles of empty space. The silence outside their spacecraft was absolute. No atmosphere to carry sound waves, no wind to rustle through vegetation, no living creatures to disturb the ancient quiet of a world that had known only the silence of the cosmic void for billions of years. You can let this moment blur softly, and the story will carry on through the careful preparations for activities that no human had ever attempted before. But the significance of this moment extended far beyond the technical achievement of landing on the moon. It represented humanity's first tentative step toward becoming a spacefaring species, the beginning of an expansion beyond Earth that might eventually carry human consciousness to every corner of the solar system and beyond. The lunar regolith that supported Eagle's landing legs had been formed over geological ages by the constant bombardment of meteorites ranging in size from microscopic dust particles to massive asteroids. This ancient surface material, unchanged for millions of years, would soon be disturbed by human footsteps that would leave permanent impressions in a world without wind or weather to erase them. There will be nothing to solve right now. Only the steady progression of events that were carrying humanity toward its first direct contact with an alien world. The planned surface activities would last only a few hours, but they would yield scientific information and symbolic significance that would influence human understanding of its place in the universe for generations to come. Picture yourself walking through the scientific importance of the samples that would be collected during the moonwalk. The rocks and soil of the lunar surface contained information about the early history of the solar system that had been preserved in the airless, geologically inactive environment of the moon. These materials would be analyzed in laboratories around the world, providing insights into the formation of planets and the processes that had shaped the cosmic neighborhood where Earth existed. Feel the weight of history around you as the crew prepared for activities that would transform them from pilots and engineers into explorers and geologists. The training they had received in field geology would now be applied on a world where no geologist had ever worked before, where every sample collected and every observation made would add to human understanding of planetary science and cosmic evolution. Meanwhile, somewhere in the distance back on Earth, Mike Collins orbited the moon alone in the command module Columbia, carrying the responsibility of being the crew's only link to home during these critical hours. His solitude during each orbit carried him around the far side of the moon, where radio communications with Earth were impossible, and he became, temporarily, the most isolated human being in the universe. During these periods of radio blackout, he was completely alone with his thoughts and the magnificent desolation of the lunar landscape passing beneath Columbia's windows. The equipment that had been loaded into Eagle's storage compartments represented humanity's first attempt to equip explorers for work on another world. The tools included geological hammers designed for use in pressurized gloves, sample containers that could preserve lunar materials for analysis on Earth, and scientific instruments that would measure properties of the lunar environment that could not be determined from orbital observations. Let yourself drift back to that winter night when routine activities took on extraordinary significance simply because of where they were being performed. The post-landing checklist that the crew was working through systematically had been developed through years of simulation and testing. But this was the first time it was being performed on the actual surface of another world, where any unexpected problems could not be resolved by simply terminating the simulation and starting over. And if you drift off here, nothing important will be missed. The story will carry on through the final preparations for humanity's first moonwalk. But the real adventure was only beginning. In just a few more hours, the hatch of Eagle would open, and human beings would step out onto the surface of an alien world for the first time in the 4.5 billion-year history of life on Earth. Time moves like honey as we travel through the profound significance of this moment when humanity crossed the threshold from a single planet species to something larger and more ambitious. The footsteps that would soon be pressed into the lunar regolith would mark the beginning of human expansion into the cosmos, the first chapter in a story that might eventually span the galaxy and transform human consciousness in ways that could not yet be imagined. Still, one small piece didn't quite settle into place, like a symphony with one unresolved chord that prevented complete harmony. The technical challenges had been overcome through brilliant engineering and courageous piloting. The spiritual significance had been acknowledged through Aldrin's private communion service. But the full meaning of this achievement would only become clear as humanity began to understand its implications for the future of human civilization. The low-gravity environment that the astronauts would soon experience directly would affect every aspect of their movements and activities on the lunar surface. Walking, picking up objects, maintaining balance, all the ordinary activities of human life would require adjustment to the reduced gravitational field that made everything weigh only 1/6 of its Earth weight. This alien physics would influence every moment of their surface exploration. Not dangerous, just strangely incomplete without acknowledging the deeper implications of what was happening. The successful landing and the spiritual ceremony that had followed represented more than personal achievement or religious expression. They marked humanity's first tentative step toward becoming citizens of the universe, rather than simply inhabitants of a single planet in a cosmos filled with billions of other worlds. And yet, something about it felt unfinished in the gentlest way. The landing had been successful, the post-landing procedures were proceeding normally, and the crew was preparing for surface operations that would write new chapters in the history of human exploration. But the real test of this remarkable mission would come when the astronauts opened their spacecraft's hatch and stepped out into an environment that had never known human presence, carrying with them the dreams and hopes of an entire species that was learning to reach beyond the comfortable boundaries of its birth world. That's one small step for man, one giant leap for mankind. Picture yourself walking through that moment when words spoken softly into a radio microphone carried across the vacuum of space and entered human consciousness forever. Neil Armstrong's voice, calm and measured despite the profound significance of what he was announcing, delivered these words as his left boot touched the lunar regolith and pressed the first human footprint into the ancient surface of another world. The moment had been anticipated by millions of people watching and listening around the Earth, but nothing could have prepared them for the surreal beauty of the television images that began broadcasting from the lunar surface. The ghostly figures moving in slow motion across the gray landscape seemed to belong more to dreams than reality. Human beings transformed into otherworldly creatures by the bulky pressure suits that kept them alive in the hostile environment of the moon. Feel the weight of history around you as Buzz Aldrin followed Armstrong down Eagle's Ladder 19 minutes later, becoming the second human being to walk on another world. His first words upon stepping onto the surface captured something that no amount of preparation or simulation could have anticipated. Beautiful view. Beautiful desolation. The phrase would echo through history as perhaps the most poetic description ever offered of an alien landscape. The surface operations that followed unfolded with the careful choreography that had been rehearsed countless times in training, but performed now in an environment where every movement seemed to take place in slow motion. The reduced gravity of the moon affected everything. The way dust fell when disturbed by footsteps, the graceful arcs described by objects thrown or dropped, the peculiar bouncing gait that became necessary for efficient movement across the regolith. Let yourself drift back to that winter night when humanity began its first direct exploration of another world, carrying out scientific investigations that had been planned for years but never attempted in actual lunar conditions. The geological samples collected during these precious hours would be analyzed in laboratories around the world, providing insights into the formation of planets and the early history of the solar system that could not have been obtained through any other means. As you settle into this story, visualize the moment when the American flag was planted in the lunar soil, its fabric specially treated to withstand the harsh solar radiation and temperature extremes of the airless environment. The ceremony was brief but profoundly moving, a symbolic claiming of new territory for all humanity while honoring the nation whose vision and resources had made this achievement possible. But there were aspects of the surface operations that would remain hidden from public view for years to come. Details that revealed the deeply human dimensions of this technological triumph. The crew had been instructed to maintain constant communication with mission control. But there were moments of private reflection and personal awe that could not be captured by radio transmissions or television cameras. Time moves like honey as we travel through the complex emotions that accompanied humanity's first steps on another world. The astronauts experienced a mixture of professional focus and personal wonder, carrying out their assigned tasks while simultaneously absorbing the profound significance of being the first humans to stand on the surface of the moon and look back at Earth hanging like a blue marble in the black sky of space. Imagine the sounds of the moonwalk as experienced by the astronauts themselves. The steady whisper of oxygen flowing through their life support systems. The electronic hum of radio communications. The soft sounds of their own breathing, amplified by the microphones inside their helmets. Outside their pressure suits, perfect silence prevailed in the vacuum that had never carried sound waves of any kind. The tools and equipment that had been specially designed for use on the lunar surface performed exactly as intended, allowing the astronauts to collect samples, deploy scientific instruments, and document their activities with photographs that would become iconic images of human exploration. But the experience of using these tools in the alien environment of the moon required constant adjustment to the reduced gravity and the limitations imposed by working in pressure suits. Slowly, the scene shifts to the scientific significance of the samples being collected from the Sea of Tranquility. These materials, formed billions of years ago during the violent early history of the solar system, had been preserved in the airless, geologically inactive environment of the moon. They contained information about planetary formation processes that had long since been erased from Earth's surface by weathering, erosion, and the constant recycling of crustal materials. The television images being broadcast to Earth showed human beings moving across an utterly alien landscape. But they could not convey the profound sense of isolation and vulnerability that the astronauts experienced during their surface operations. They were completely dependent on their pressure suits and life support systems, surrounded by an environment that would kill them instantly if their equipment failed. Yet they moved with apparent confidence and purpose, trained professionals carrying out one of the most dangerous assignments ever undertaken by human beings. Breathe deeply and let the years fade away to those moments when scientific investigation took precedence over symbolic gestures or public relations concerns. The crew deployed a seismometer designed to detect moonquakes and meteorite impacts, providing scientists on Earth with their first direct measurements of seismic activity on another world. They also left a laser reflector that would allow precise measurements of the distance between Earth and Moon for decades to come. The regolith that the astronauts walked across represented 4.5 billion years of meteorite bombardment, a surface layer formed by the gradual pulverization of lunar bedrock by impacts ranging in size from microscopic dust particles to massive asteroids. This ancient material, completely uncontaminated by atmospheric weathering or biological processes, preserved a record of solar system history that could not be found anywhere on Earth. You can let this moment blur softly, and the story will carry on through activities that had never been attempted before in the history of human exploration. But the surface operations represented more than scientific investigation or symbolic achievement. They marked humanity's first tentative steps toward becoming a multiplanetary species, the beginning of an expansion beyond Earth that might eventually carry human consciousness throughout the solar system and beyond. Picture yourself walking through the technical complexity of maintaining life support systems during extended operations on the lunar surface. The portable life support systems that kept the astronauts alive were marvels of engineering that had to function flawlessly in temperature extremes, vacuum conditions, and the constant bombardment of cosmic radiation that reached the lunar surface unfiltered by any atmosphere. The duration of the moonwalk was carefully limited by the capacity of the portable life support systems and the need to maintain adequate reserves for emergency situations. Every minute spent on the surface consumed oxygen, water, and electrical power that could not be replenished until the astronauts returned to the safety of Eagle's pressurized cabin. These limitations meant that surface activities had to be carried out with maximum efficiency, every action planned and rehearsed to accomplish as much as possible within the available time. There will be nothing to solve right now. Only the steady progression of activities that were writing new chapters in the history of human exploration. The crew moved with the purposeful efficiency of trained professionals, but they were also experiencing wonder and awe that no amount of training could have fully prepared them for. Standing on the surface of another world and looking back at Earth provided a perspective on human existence that had never been available to previous generations. Feel the weight of history around you as the crew prepared to conclude their surface operations and return to the safety of Eagle's cabin. The samples they had collected, the photographs they had taken, and the scientific instruments they had deployed would provide researchers with decades of material for analysis and study. But the immediate priority was ensuring their safe return to the lunar module and preparing for the ascent to lunar orbit that would begin their journey home. Let yourself drift back to that winter night when humanity's first visit to another world was drawing to a close. But the implications of this achievement were only beginning to be understood. The successful surface operations had demonstrated that human beings could survive and work effectively in the alien environment of the Moon, opening possibilities for future missions that might establish permanent outposts on the lunar surface or use the moon as a stepping stone for exploration of Mars and other destinations throughout the solar system. Picture yourself walking through the technical complexity of Eagle's landing radar system, which was providing continuous updates on their height above the lunar surface. This radar had never been tested under actual lunar conditions, and its performance during these final minutes would determine whether future lunar missions could rely on automated landing systems or would require human pilots for every approach. The radar beams reflected off the regolith below, measuring the time required for radio signals to make the round trip between spacecraft and surface. And if you drift off here, nothing important will be missed. The story will carry on through the careful balance of technology and human skill that was bringing Eagle to within a few feet of the lunar surface. But the outcome was still uncertain, still dependent on Armstrong's ability to find a safe landing site within the remaining fuel allowance, still balanced on the narrow margin between success and the need for immediate abort. Feel the weight of history around you as Armstrong finally made his decision, committing Eagle to approach toward the relatively smooth area he had spotted beyond the boulder field. This decision represented the culmination of decades of astronaut training, test pilot experience, and engineering preparation. Every aspect of Armstrong's background, his experience flying experimental aircraft, his understanding of Eagle's flight characteristics, his ability to process multiple streams of information under extreme pressure, was focused on this single moment when human judgment would determine the outcome of humanity's greatest adventure. Let yourself drift back to that winter night when the impossible became routine through the application of human courage and technical precision. The lunar regolith that would soon support Eagle's landing legs had been formed over billions of years by the constant bombardment of meteorites, creating a layer of fine dust and rock fragments that covered the moon's surface to unknown depths. Would it be firm enough to provide stable support, or would the spacecraft sink into loose material that might prevent their ascent stage from launching successfully when the time came to return to lunar orbit? Meanwhile, somewhere in the distance of mission control, specialists were preparing for the post-landing phase of the mission, assuming that Eagle would touch down successfully within the next few seconds. The flight activities officer was ready to begin the timeline for surface operations, while the environmental control and life support engineer prepared to monitor the crew's life support systems during their planned rest period before beginning the first human exploration of another world. Still, one small piece didn't quite settle into place. The fuel consumption during this extended search for a landing site had pushed Eagle to the very edge of its operational limits, testing margins that had been calculated to provide safe reserves for unexpected situations, exactly like this one. Every engineer who had worked on fuel consumption estimates was mentally recalculating their numbers, wondering if the safety margins they had built into the mission profile would prove adequate for the challenges Armstrong was now facing. The 16 attitude control thrusters that maintained Eagle's orientation during descent had been firing almost continuously during this final phase of the landing, consuming their own fuel supplies to keep the spacecraft properly aligned for touchdown. These small rocket engines were essential for preventing Eagle from tumbling out of control, but their fuel consumption hadn't been factored into some of the more optimistic landing scenarios that mission planners had considered during the years of preparation leading to this moment. Not dangerous, just strangely incomplete without acknowledging the deeper implications of what was happening in those final seconds. This wasn't simply a demonstration of American technological capability or a victory in the Cold War competition with the Soviet Union. It was a moment when humanity reached beyond the comfortable boundaries of Earth and touched another world, carrying with them all the complexity and contradiction and beautiful imperfection that defined human nature throughout history. And yet, something about it felt unfinished in the gentlest way. The technical challenges were being met with exactly the kind of skill and preparation that the Apollo program represented. But there were human elements to this story that transcended mere engineering achievement. The families watching and waiting on Earth, the sense of representing not just American ambition, but human curiosity and courage. The communion elements that would soon transform this technological triumph into something that touched the essence of what it meant to be human in a vast and mysterious universe. And in that calm uncertainty, the final seconds ticked away toward a moment that would either crown humanity's greatest adventure with success or require an immediate abort that would delay the dream of walking on another world for months or possibly years to come. Contact light. Picture yourself walking through that moment when two simple words changed everything. When the gentle touch of Eagle's footpad probe against lunar regolith signaled the end of humanity's 4.5 billion-year isolation from the rest of the universe. Buzz Aldrin's voice carried those words across the void, with the calm precision of a pilot reporting routine flight information. But everyone who heard them understood that nothing would ever be quite the same again. "Engine stop," Neil Armstrong announced immediately afterward, his gloved hand already moving to shut down the descent engine that had carried them safely through the final seconds of fuel reserves. The sudden silence in Eagle's cabin was profound after minutes of engine noise and system alerts, a quietness that seemed to expand outward from their tiny pressurized capsule into the infinite vacuum of space that surrounded them. Feel the weight of history around you as Mission Control erupted in a chaos of controlled celebration and urgent technical consultations. Charlie Duke's voice crackled back through the radio with barely contained excitement. "Roger, Tranquility Base. We copy you on the ground. You got a bunch of guys about to turn blue. We're breathing again. Thanks a lot." His words would be remembered and quoted for generations. But in that moment, they simply expressed the relief of people who had been holding their breath for longer than seemed humanly possible. But there was something else in that moment, something that wouldn't become clear until years later, when the full story of this remarkable night was finally told. As Eagle settled onto the lunar surface with a gentle bump that barely registered through the spacecraft's shock absorbers, one of the most significant religious ceremonies in human history was about to begin in complete silence, hidden from the world by NASA's concerns about legal challenges and public controversy. Let yourself drift back to that winter night when the impossible had just become reality, but the real adventure was only beginning. The landing had been successful, but Eagle now sat on an alien world where the slightest mistake could doom its crew to become permanent residents of a landscape that had never known life. Every system would need to be checked, every procedure followed with absolute precision, every decision made with the understanding that Earth was 250,000 miles away, and no rescue mission would be possible if something went wrong. As you settle into this story, visualize the scene outside Eagle's windows in those first minutes after touchdown. The sea of tranquility stretched away in all directions, its ancient surface unmarked by wind or water, unchanged for millions of years except for the occasional impact of meteorites. The sunlight cast sharp shadows in the airless environment, creating a landscape of brilliant whites and absolute blacks, with no atmospheric diffusion to soften the harsh contrasts. Time moves like honey as we travel through the immediate post-landing procedures that would determine whether Eagle's crew could safely exit their spacecraft or would be forced to launch immediately for an emergency return to lunar orbit. The environmental control and life support engineer and mission control monitored oxygen and carbon dioxide levels while the crew worked through their extensive checklist of system verifications. Every component that had performed flawlessly during the landing now needed to be confirmed as operational for the surface stay and eventual ascent. The lunar module's design represented one of the most remarkable engineering achievements in human history. A spacecraft capable of landing on an airless world, supporting human life during surface operations, and then launching the crew safely back to lunar orbit using only the upper half of the vehicle. The lower descent stage, which had carried them from orbit to the surface, would remain behind as a permanent monument to humanity's first visit to another world, its 4 legs and engine bell marking the spot where people had first walked on the moon. Slowly, the scene shifts to the theological preparations that had been made in complete secrecy during the weeks leading up to this moment. Buzz Aldrin had worked closely with his pastor at Webster Presbyterian Church to develop a communion service that would be appropriate for celebration on the lunar surface. The bread had been blessed in a quiet ceremony, attended by only family members and close friends. The wine poured into a specially designed chalice that could function in the low-gravity environment of the moon. But NASA's concerns about legal challenges had forced these plans underground. The space agency was still dealing with the aftermath of atheist activist Madalyn Murray O'Hair's lawsuit challenging the Apollo 8 crew's reading of Genesis during their Christmas Eve broadcast from lunar orbit. Agency administrators had made it clear that any religious activities during the lunar mission should be kept private and personal, not broadcast to the worldwide audience that was following every moment of the historic mission. Imagine the sounds of Eagle's cabin during those first minutes on the surface. The whisper of life support systems maintaining breathable atmosphere, the electronic hum of guidance computers continuing their complex calculations, the subtle creaking of metal structures adjusting to the temperature extremes of the lunar environment. Outside the spacecraft, perfect silence prevailed in the vacuum that had never carried sound waves of any kind. Breathe deeply and let the years fade away to those crucial moments when Buzz Aldrin made a request that would echo through religious history. Speaking into his radio microphone, he asked for a few moments of silence from Mission Control and invited everyone listening around the world to pause and give thanks in their own way for the historic achievement they had just witnessed. His words were carefully chosen to avoid specific religious references that might trigger legal challenges, but they carried profound spiritual significance for the communion ceremony he was about to conduct in private. "Houston, this is Eagle," Aldrin said, his voice calm and measured despite the magnitude of the moment. "I'd like to take this opportunity to ask every person listening in, wherever and whomever they may be, to pause for a moment and contemplate the events of the past few hours, and to give thanks in his or her own way." You can let this moment blur softly, and the story will carry on through the remarkable ceremony that was about to unfold in the cramped cabin of humanity's first lunar spacecraft. But the communion service that Aldrin had planned represented something that transcended the technical achievement of landing on the moon. A recognition that human beings carried their deepest beliefs and most profound spiritual needs into even the most extraordinary circumstances. Picture yourself walking through the careful preparations as Aldrin unpacked the communion elements from his personal kit. The bread had been specially prepared to remain fresh during the long journey from Earth. The wine sealed in containers designed to prevent contamination or spoilage in the artificial environment of the spacecraft. The silver chalice had been crafted by skilled artisans at his church, its design both beautiful and functional for use in the reduced gravity of the lunar surface. There will be nothing to solve right now, only the quiet progression of one of the most remarkable religious ceremonies in human history. Aldrin read silently from the Gospel of John, words he had written on a small card and carried with him on the journey. "I am the vine, you are the branches. Whoever remains in me, and I in him, will bear much fruit, for you can do nothing without me." The passage seemed particularly appropriate for this moment, when humanity had reached beyond Earth's protective embrace and touched another world. Feel the weight of history around you as Aldrin poured the wine into the chalice, watching in fascination as the liquid behaved unlike anything he had ever observed on Earth. In the moon's 1/6 gravity, the wine moved with dreamlike slowness, curling gracefully up the sides of the cup in patterns that would have been impossible in Earth's stronger gravitational field. The sight was both beautiful and profound, a reminder that even the most familiar substances behaved differently in this alien environment. The bread and wine represented something that no technological achievement could provide, a connection to spiritual traditions that had sustained humanity throughout its long history on Earth. In that cramped cabin on the surface of an airless world, Aldrin was participating in a ritual that linked him to countless generations of believers who had found meaning and hope in simple elements of bread and wine. The communion service was, in its own quiet way, as remarkable an achievement as the technological miracle that had delivered him safely to the lunar surface. Let yourself drift back to that winter night when faith and science found common ground in the most unlikely place imaginable. Neil Armstrong, though not participating in the communion ceremony, respected his crewmates' need for this moment of private devotion. The landing had been successful, their spacecraft was functioning normally, and they had several hours of scheduled rest time before beginning the preparation for humanity's first walk on another world. Meanwhile, somewhere in the distance, back on Earth, families and friends of the astronauts were experiencing their own mixture of relief and anticipation. The landing had been successful, but the surface operations that lay ahead would present new challenges and new risks. Joan Aldrin, watching the mission coverage on television, didn't yet know about the communion service her husband was conducting on the lunar surface, but she shared his deep faith and would have understood the significance of carrying their religious beliefs into this extraordinary adventure. And if you drift off here, nothing important will be missed. The communion service continued in silence and privacy, a moment of spiritual reflection that would remain largely hidden from public knowledge for years to come. But the ceremony represented something essential about human nature, the need to find meaning and connection, even in circumstances that transcended ordinary experience. Time moves like honey as we travel through the layers of significance that surrounded this simple religious ritual. The first food ever consumed on the moon was communion bread. The first liquid ever poured on another world was wine blessed for a sacred purpose. These facts would not become widely known for years, partly because of NASA's sensitivity about religious expression in government-sponsored activities, partly because Aldrin himself wondered whether it had been appropriate to conduct a specifically Christian ceremony during a mission that represented all of humanity. Slowly, the scene shifts to the broader context of this historic moment. When people around the world were beginning to understand that humanity had successfully landed on the moon, radio and television broadcasts carried news of Eagle's safe touchdown to every continent, translated into dozens of languages, received by audiences that ranged from heads of state to children listening with their families. The achievement belonged to everyone, regardless of nationality or belief system or political affiliation. Still, one small piece didn't quite settle into place. The communion service, beautiful and meaningful as it was, represented only one perspective on the spiritual significance of lunar landing. Other religious traditions would have found different ways to mark this historic moment, and Aldrin himself would later wonder whether a more inclusive ceremony might have been more appropriate for an achievement that belonged to all of humanity. But there was something perfect about the quiet, private nature of the service, conducted in the cramped cabin of a spacecraft sitting on the lunar surface, while the rest of the world waited for the first human footsteps on another world. The communion elements that Webster Presbyterian Church had blessed for this purpose served their intended function, providing a moment of spiritual connection and reflection that prepared the astronauts for the extraordinary experiences that lay ahead. Not dangerous, just strangely incomplete without acknowledging the deeper significance of what had just been accomplished. The successful landing represented more than technological achievement or national prestige. It was a moment when humanity reached beyond the comfortable boundaries of Earth and established its first foothold on another world, carrying with them all the complexity and contradiction and beautiful imperfection that defined human nature throughout history. And yet, something about it felt unfinished in the gentlest way. The landing had been successful. The communion service had provided spiritual grounding for the challenges ahead. But the real adventure was only beginning. In a few hours, Neil Armstrong would open Eagle's hatch and step out onto the lunar surface, followed by Buzz Aldrin, and together they would begin humanity's first exploration of another world. And in that calm uncertainty, the surface of the moon waited patiently for the first human footsteps, just as it had waited through geological ages for this moment, when Earth's children would finally reach out and touch the cosmic shore that had beckoned to them since the beginning of human consciousness. Picture yourself walking through the technical complexity of Eagle's post-landing procedures, when every system needed to be verified as operational before the crew could safely exit their spacecraft. The environmental control and life support system had performed flawlessly during the descent, but now it faced the challenge of maintaining breathable atmosphere while parked on the lunar surface, where temperature extremes ranged from minus 250 degrees in shadow to plus 250 degrees in direct sunlight. The guidance computer that had helped them navigate to this historic landing site was now calculating the precise position of Eagle relative to landmarks that had been photographed during previous orbital missions. These calculations would be essential for the eventual ascent from the lunar surface, when the upper stage of the lunar module would need to achieve exactly the right trajectory to rendezvous with Mike Collins in the command module orbiting overhead. Feel the weight of history around you as the crew worked through procedures that had been rehearsed hundreds of times in simulators, but never in the actual environment of another world. Every switch position had to be verified, every instrument reading checked against expected values, every system confirmed as ready to support the surface operations that would begin in just a few hours. The margin for error was essentially zero. Any significant malfunction could either trap them on the surface or compromise their ability to return safely to Earth. Let yourself drift back to that winter night when the most routine activities took on extraordinary significance, simply because they were being performed on the surface of the moon. Buzz Aldrin's communion service had provided spiritual grounding for the challenges ahead, but there were practical preparations that needed to be completed before either astronaut could venture outside the protective environment of their spacecraft.